You are listening to The Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today we are going to look at 4 of the most common obstacles to healing. In other words, what gets in the way? God created our hearts, minds, and bodies to heal. We are designed to heal. If you get a cut, it heals. If you break your arm, the bone heals, as long as the conditions for healing are right. What I want to do today is identify 4 things that I frequently run into which block the natural healing process from unfolding when it comes to trauma, harm from our growing up years. Okay, the first thing that gets in the way of healing is minimizing your story. Minimizing your story. Look, it is almost guaranteed that you are minimizing your story. Now, how can I say that even though I don't know you? Because I cannot think of a single person who has come into my office and done the opposite. Someone who believed that their story was affecting them more than it actually was. Someone who was blowing their story out of proportion, right? Everyone I know minimizes their story. Now, by minimize, what do I mean? I mean that you think your past doesn't affect you very much today. Minimizing means that you are dismissing or discounting how significantly your growing up years have shaped the neurons that filter every experience you have today. Minimizing means that you don't really believe that your story as a boy or a girl continues to profoundly affect your thoughts, feelings, and choices today. Everyone I know minimizes their story, including me. I need other people to help me see where I'm still minimizing the harm that was done to me as a boy. Now, in Jeremiah 6 and 8, you've heard me talk about this passage. Boy, do I love it. Okay, God says something fascinating to the leaders of Israel. He gets very angry because the leaders of his people are minimizing the wounds of Israel. Here's how God puts it in Jeremiah 6, and it's repeated in 8. Speaking about the leaders of Israel, God says, quote, "They dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace." Now, what's God saying here? God is saying that the leaders do not take the wounds of the people seriously. They treat the wounds of the people as though those wounds weren't serious. Peace, peace, everything's fine. Hey, look, everything's fine. Peace, peace. When there is no peace. Now, here's my point. Most of us do the same thing with regard to our own wounds. We minimize our wounds, saying, peace, peace, everything's fine. It was no big deal. When there is no peace in our bodies. For example, look, suppose you're having coffee with someone and she is talking about something hard in her life, in her story, and you are compassionately listening to this woman as she vulnerably shares about her pain. And then suddenly she says, but I shouldn't complain. Look at so-and-so who's struggling with so much more hard stuff than me. That's minimizing your story. This woman is comparing her story and her difficulties to someone else's story. And her point is that she shouldn't be so focused on her pain because others have it worse. Others have it worse. Oh my gosh. Please, why do you feel the need to compare your pain and your story to another person? Anytime you compare your story to someone else's, you are minimizing your story. You are dressing the wounds of yourself as a boy or a girl as though those wounds were not serious. I was a participant on a men's retreat a couple years back, and we were asked to share some of our stories of harm in groups of four from our growing up years. We were put in groups of four and asked to just kind of share with one another some of our trauma, some of our stories of harm. And there was a man in my group, and this is how he began when he started to share. He said, "Look, I know we're supposed to talk about bad things that happened to us, but when I think back on my childhood, I just don't really have any harmful moments. I mean, my parents got divorced when I was 11, and that was a little hard, but it wasn't that bad. I do remember having to tell my mom that my dad was having an affair. But those were probably the only bad things. No one ever hit me. I was never sexually abused. I certainly don't have any experiences of trauma or anything like that." That's what this man shared. Do you see how he is minimizing the heartache of his story for an 11-year-old boy to tell his mother, to be the one who has to tell his mother that his father is having an affair? Now, look, I'm not blaming this man. I get it. Why didn't this man think of this experience as an 11-year-old as traumatic? Why didn't he think of that as a big deal? Because we all tend to minimize the harm we've experienced. It's natural and automatic. For this man, having to tell his mom about his dad's affair, look, that's just the way things were in his family. That was just normal for him. So of course he didn't think it was harmful to his 11-year-old self. Here's the bottom line with this one. The bottom line is you do not want your painful experiences to have affected you as much as they have. And so you don't give those stories the weight that they deserve. You don't want your painful experiences from your growing up years to have affected you as much as they have, and so you don't give those stories weight. You don't want that jerk who hurt you so much as a child to still be affecting you and still be affecting your life. And so you don't give the stories of your experiences with this jerk the weight that those stories deserve. Now, we have many strategies for minimizing our story. Here's a common one. Have you ever said something like the following? Okay, I'll acknowledge that my mom harmed me in some ways, but it was nothing like what she endured as a kid. Have you ever said that or thought that? I sure have. I mean, dozens of times, dozens. I've had many experiences in which I am meaningfully reflecting on one of my stories of heartache, and I'm feeling the weight of my sorrow and grief. And suddenly, this thing rises up in me, and I think, but my mom had a bad childhood, far worse than mine. Now, what's happening here? I'm minimizing my story. Look, let me be clear. The sentence, my mom had a worse childhood than me, it might be 100% true. However, I am currently using that sentence to escape the heartache of my story. I am using the idea, the possibility, because it's an imponderable. I don't know if my mom had a worse childhood than me. I can't know that. But I am using the idea that my mom had a bad childhood to allow me to escape the painfulness of feeling my sadness and my sorrow. Anytime you compare your story to someone else's, whether it's your mother or friend, someone you read about on Instagram, anytime you compare your story to someone else's, you are escaping the heartache of your story. And to be a little bit more precise, anytime you compare your story to someone else's story, you are engaged in self-contempt. Yes, anytime you compare your story to someone else's, You are avoiding your big feelings by shifting into a posture of self-contempt. What do I mean by self-contempt? Self-contempt is hatred or disdain or disgust for the younger you or the present tense you. Why do you have contempt for the younger you? Why do you insist on dressing the wounds of that boy or girl as though they were not serious? The presence of self-contempt always indicates a minimization of the weight of your story, a minimization of the gravity of what you endured as a boy or a girl. Now, here's another way we minimize our story, another strategy. Suppose you can't remember any bad things that happened to you as a kid. Lots of people can't. Suppose you're reflecting on your life with a friend, and you can't think of anything harmful that happened to you. And so your friend asks you, okay, well, look, tell me about some good experiences you had growing up. Tell me about a time when you felt emotionally comforted by your mom after a hard day. Or tell me about a time when you felt really celebrated by your dad. If your mind goes blank when you are trying to think of memories of being comforted or celebrated by your parents, that's a big deal. Okay, that is a big deal. Some of you had experiences growing up that were devoid of goodness. Your parents didn't get a divorce when you were a kid. Your dad didn't hit you. You don't have a history of sexual abuse. But your parents were more committed to being married than they were to loving one another. And even though your dad never hit you, he never hugged you either. Do you have any idea how tragic it is that you can't tell me stories of when your mom sat on the edge of your bed and was truly attuned to you and provided genuine comfort and care? It is very hard to give weight to the absence of something. If your story is one in which there was an immense void of goodness, it can be very hard to give weight to that because you're actually acknowledging the absence of something. Okay, that is obstacle to healing number one. It is likely that you are minimizing your story. Obstacle to healing number two, and this is a big one for people who have spent time in a church community. Obstacle number two is spiritualizing the bad things that have happened to you. Now, what does that mean? Okay. Spiritualizing refers to using theology or the Bible to avoid engaging with what you have endured, to avoid grappling with what has actually happened to your heart, mind, and body. Spiritualizing refers to using theology or using the Bible to avoid feeling your feelings about what you have suffered. Spiritualizing in this sense is basically just another way of minimizing your story, but I wanted to highlight it separately because it is so common, especially for Christians, and it is particularly pernicious. Have you ever used theology or the Bible to minimize the harm that was done to you? All right, if you have, you likely came by this one honestly. The vast majority of churches are very skilled at creating environments in which the harsh realities of living in a sinful world are spiritualized away. In the words of Dan Allender, the truth is largely lacking in our world. And what I would add to Dan's sentence is that the church, on the whole, is no more truthful than those outside the church. We all have a way of not looking at how painful life can be and has been. Let me give an example of spiritualizing away harm. Let me just give some examples. Suppose you have written a story about one of the times that you were traumatized as an 8-year-old girl. And you read the story to a friend, to a counselor, and your friend or counselor presses in a little bit and names how hard that experience that you've just read about must have been for an 8-year-old girl. And as soon as your friend is done speaking, you immediately find yourself saying, yeah, it was hard, but I see now how God used that time to draw me closer to him and to shape my character. Now, what are you doing in that moment? What is happening inside your brain and body? You are spiritualizing away the big feelings that you would have felt if you had stayed with the reality of the heartache of the story. You are using spirituality to avoid feeling your feelings. You're appealing to God's goodness to avoid sitting with that 8-year-old girl, to avoid drawing close to her. You are evading the discomfort of your own story by saying, well, I know God works all things for good in my life. And I can see now how God was doing that even when I was being abused as an 8-year-old. Now, please hear me well. I am in no way disagreeing with the claim that God works all things for good in your life. Nor am I disagreeing that God was involved with that 8-year-old girl. I am simply wanting you to grapple with this question. Why do you need to bring up God or theology or the Bible right now? Right when your friend was giving weight to your pain and empathizing with you and really being with you in it. Okay, I am going to say a sentence, but I am not going to support it. I just don't have time, not going to do it. Here's the sentence. There is a spirit of optimism in the American evangelical church, and it is a spirit. There is a spirit of optimism in the American evangelical church, particularly the white American evangelical church, and it is a spirit. The spirit of optimism has nothing to do with the gospel of Jesus. The goal of the spirit of optimism is to provoke you to minimize your story so that you will not take your wounds seriously, so that you will not receive the comfort of God and experience healing. Optimism says that may have been a bad experience, but God used it for good. Optimism says that may have been trauma, but God drew me closer to him through it. Optimism is a spirit that entices you to close your eyes to the crucifixions in your life and only look at the resurrections. The second obstacle to healing is spiritualizing away the bad things that have happened to you. Number 3, the third thing that frequently gets in the way of healing is self-contempt. Now, I've already talked a little bit about the fact that anytime you compare your story to someone else's, you are engaged in self-contempt. But there are many, many forms of self-contempt, and all of them block the healing process from naturally unfolding. So, what are some of these other forms of self-contempt? Well, consider the following example. You're an 8th grade girl, and your class is visiting an elementary school to help with one of the younger kids' classes. And you're a little heavy, and you're becoming self-conscious about your weight. Your 8th grade class is asked to sit down in those smaller chairs, the ones that the little kids have. And one of your classmates, as you're about to sit down, points at you and whispers to his friends, "I hope she doesn't break that chair when she sits down." You feel immense shame wash over your body. Instead of sitting in that shame, which is intolerable, you join them in their contempt of you by thinking, "You are so fat. Why are you always snacking on junk food after school? Why can't you have more self-control? If you played sports like other normal people, this wouldn't have happened. You're so lazy. And on it goes. And you stab yourself with darts a dozen more times before the day is over. Did your classmate hurt you with their contempt for you? Oh, yes. But your self-contempt, by the end of the day, has done far more damage. From that day forward, how many times do you look in the mirror and berate yourself for your weight? This is the goal of evil. To seduce you to inflict violence on yourself. Self-contempt is violence from you to you. From you to you. The function of self-contempt is to protect you from feeling your big feelings. In this example, shame. What is your posture toward the younger you? Think about yourself as a middle schooler. Like right now, just think back to when you were in middle school. See yourself in the halls of your school or at your house as a middle schooler. Now, how do you feel toward that boy or girl? What is your posture toward that middle schooler? More often than not, our posture is not very kind. It's this sense of, he was so needy. Or she was such a fool for thinking her grandfather actually cared about her. Or he was such a wimp that he didn't fight back. Or she liked it when her stepdad fondled her. She wanted it. It was exciting. Or it's simply a posture of, I can't stand her. I can't stand her. Do you hear the violence in those accusations? The reason that self-contempt blocks the healing process is because when you are awash in self-contempt, you don't have to feel your feelings. In fact, you can't feel your feelings. When you are hating yourself, you can't access your raw, vulnerable, unfelt big feelings. As long as you are angry at the younger you, as long as you are disgusted or repulsed or ashamed of the younger you, you won't be able to access your sorrow, your shame, your anger at others, your big unfelt feelings. And you can't heal until you feel your unfelt feelings. Okay, so what are you supposed to do when you realize that you have slipped into self-contempt? The antidote to self-contempt is kindness. Kindness. As you engage your story, do you have a posture of contempt toward yourself? Or do you have a posture that is at least moving toward kindness for yourself? Here's a better question. When you realize that you are feeling anger and disdain for yourself, because we all get sucked into self-contempt, all of us. When you realize it, can you soften your heart in kindness toward yourself just a little bit? Healing is a natural process. God made our minds and bodies to heal. However, things can get in the way and block that very natural healing process. And one of those things, a big one, is self-contempt, self-hatred. There has to be a growing kindness toward yourself as a boy or a girl in order to heal. Okay, number 4, the final obstacle that I'm going to address today, the final obstacle to healing, is perhaps the biggest one for modern people, and that is the pace of your life. The insane, inhuman pace of your life. Most of us live our lives at a frenetic pace. In other words, we are constantly on the go, moving from one thing to the next. Here is a trustworthy saying: you cannot heal without a growing ability to be present to yourself. You cannot heal without slowing down. Each one of you listening has an inner life of thoughts, feelings, longings. How much time do you spend noticing that inner life? How much time do you spend just noticing your thoughts, feelings, and longings, rather than attending to the tasks of your day? I am inviting you to spend more time with yourself, with your heart, with all the swirl of activity in your mind. Now, the thing that stops most of us from spending time with ourselves is fear. Fear of what might be lurking in there. It can be very scary to get connected to your true thoughts and feelings. And it can be especially scary to get connected to your true longings. The frenetic pace of your life may be driven by a fear of slowing down and just being with your own heart. That would certainly make sense, particularly if you have experiences of trauma in there. But let me ask you, how much of your day is spent just being with yourself, your thoughts, your feelings, your longings, just noticing what comes up inside of you? How many hours in a given month do you set aside for doing some form of story work? If grief is a necessary part of the healing process, and it is, you have to create space and time for grief to emerge. If you are constantly moving, constantly going from one activity to the next, it is very hard to grieve because grieving requires being still and being with yourself. You've got to stop to grieve. And no one describes this dynamic, this is so good, better than Barbara Kingsolver. In her novel, The Poisonwood Bible, I love this. Listen to what one of the characters says. This is what Kingsolver writes. As long as I kept moving, my grief streamed out behind me like a swimmer's long hair in water. I knew the weight was there, but it didn't touch me. Only when I stopped did the slick, dark stuff of it come floating around my face, catching my arms and throat till I began to drown. So I just didn't stop. Now, that's a very good description of why many of us don't stop long enough to feel our sorrow and grief. We are afraid that our grief will pull us under and we'll never make it back up. But what if going down into the depths of your grief is necessary for your body to experience the natural process of healing? Summary of today's episode. Healing is a natural process that will occur when the conditions are right. 4 things that keep the conditions from being right are, that we've talked about today. 1, minimizing your story. 2, spiritualizing the harm that you've suffered. 3, a posture of self-contempt rather than kindness to the younger you. And 4, the insane pace of your life. Thank you for listening today. By the way, if this podcast has been helpful to you, please consider supporting it financially. If you go to adamyoungcounseling.com and just click on support the podcast, you will find 3 different ways to donate money to the podcast. Thanks for considering it.